Good day, everyone. In this lecture, we will discuss escalation. So let's ask ourselves the question, what is escalation? Escalation is the increase of costs or cost fluctuation. You can imagine that when the contractor is tender of the project, let's take an example where a pocket of cement costs 95 Rand per pocket. And during the construction period, the material price increased from 95 to, let's say for argument's sake, to 100 Rand. Escalation will most probably cover that increase of cost of 5 Rand. There's going to be oil and fuel increases. There's a labor wage increase during the construction period. So the escalation calculations will most probably cover that increase in cost. We also need to ask ourselves the question, is the contract fixed or is it subject to escalation? There will be in the preliminaries document, bill number 1, there will be specific indication to this regard where the contract will stipulate that this is a fixed contract. So obviously there is no escalation involved, but the contractor will allow for possible increases in his rates or cost in the case of a fixed contract. Versus a contract that is subject to escalation, the contractor knows in advance that he will price at current rates, and then we will apply the escalation formula to cover the increase in cost. There is a risk at the end of the day that the contractor will not be compensated for possible increases in cost in full, but that's a risk. The formula that we're going to use to determine or calculate the escalation, and we will calculate escalation per work group. The formula is called the Hallett formula. It was developed by a well-known quantity surveyor some years ago. The formula is called the Hallett formula, and its adjustment, which is the value of escalation, equals 0.85, that is a factor, times it by V, and V is the amount subject to escalation, and then in brackets, IE divided by IO, which is the indices, less 1. Now the IE is the work trade indices that is supplied by the Department of Statistics, which is relevant to the actual month of certificate. So if we prepare a certificate for March 2021, then the IE indices will be for March 2021, whereas the IO is the indices that is applicable for the actual base month, which is the actual tender date. So if the contractor submitted a tender June 2020, then June 2020, the indices will be applicable for June 2020 as the IO. So the formula for escalation, the Hallett formula, is 0.85 times by V, in brackets, indices IE divided by IO, less 1. The V value is the value of work done, including materials on site. In other words, what we've also stated now is that the V is now subject to escalation. So there is ways and means how you're going to determine the value of work done. You could go on site and with the contractor's representative agreed on the value, or you can work with a percentage basis where we can agree that the masonry, for instance, is 75% complete. It's very risky as well to work with a percentage basis, but we'll discuss it at a later stage when we're dealing with payment certificates. So you have to go on site and value the work done. And then also part of the V value is the cost of the materials on site. So therefore you value, let's say for instance, a masonry, the value of work done. You add all the values for the half brick wall, 270 cavity wall, etc. And then you ask the contractor to provide you with the cost of the materials on site, because there's going to be bricks on site. There's going to be, for the dugger, you've got cement and sand for the duggers, and all relevant items related to masonry, for instance. So that is part of the V value subject to escalation. So that is a process to actually determine the value of work done, including materials on site, and that will be part of our discussion under the unit payment certificates. There's also items that we need to take into account which is not subject to escalation, and there we refer to the non-adjustable items. For our purposes, we've got basically 3 items that we will identify as non-adjustable items, and they are profit, attendance, and day works. Profit and attendance is the profit and attendance related to the nominated subcontractors' work. In other words, we've got a provisional amount for electrical installation, and on top of that, the contractor will claim profit and attendance. Obviously, the profit goes to the main contractor, because the main contractor will argue and say, I also want a share of the cake. In other words, part of the electrical contract. And then attendance. Attendance is the contractor is providing services to the electrical nominated subcontractor, because the electrical nominated subcontractor is using perhaps maybe the scaffolding of the contractor, is using the electricity on the site, the contractor is paying for that. But therefore, to cover those costs, the contractor will insert an amount for attendance. In other words, he provides a service to the nominated subcontractor. So over the profit and attendance belongs to the main contractor, and that is a non-adjustable item. Day works is an extra on the project, where in the form of a contract instruction, where the contractor said, well, I will price that contract instruction at current rates. In other words, we might be halfway through the contract and there's a contract instruction, and the contractor will decide, well, I'm not going to use bill rates. I'm going to price that specific item at that specific point in time. In other words, we refer to as current rates. Day works will always be an extra on the project. So therefore, for those 3 items, profit, attendance, and day works, there is no escalation attached to those 3 items. Then the contract also makes provision that irrespective of that there's no indices available, we need to make use of the latest available indice to determine escalation. So we can't argue and say, well, we don't have the indices for this specific month because it's not been supplied by the Department of Statistics or Statistics South Africa. So you'll have to use, if there's no indice available for that specific month, you'll use the latest available indice and then calculate escalation. So you have to pay the contractor provisional escalation. That could be a nightmare, because you need to go back once you've received the revised indices for that specific month. You need to go back, and sometimes you need to go back 2-3 months down the line and adjust the escalation, because you've received the actual indice for that month. The highlight formula is also applicable only to interim payment certificates. In other words, that is from certificate 1 right up till the payment certificate at practical completion. In other words, at practical completion, we hand over the project to the client and the contractor moves off-site. So the highlight formula is applicable up till that point in time. If we look at a typical example of an escalation certificate, you'll note that all the detail, the contract reference, the contractor, who's the contractor, etc., is standard. And in this particular example, you'll see that we are preparing certificate number 8. So the escalation, although we discuss escalation now as an isolated component, it will be part and parcel of a payment certificate. Obviously, in this case, a project is subject to escalation, so therefore we need to determine the escalation for that specific month. So we are preparing, in this case, the adjustment for certificate number 8. In other words, that's the valuation payment certificate number 8. And if you see, the date of this certificate is on the 12th of December 2020. Certificate 8 on the 12th of December 2020. The tender date is was the 20th of January 2020. So here, let's define the IO and the IE indices. So the tender date is basically your IO, and the date of certificate is the IE. In this case, if you look at the completion date, that is also predetermined, because in the preliminaries it stated that the project is for, let's say, X month, or could be stated that the completion date is on the 20th of November. So that is fixed, the completion date. We can't change that. That is already stipulated in the contract data or in the principal agreement. If you look at the extended date, in other words, the contractor will claim extra days because there is perhaps maybe inclement weather, or whatever the case might be. In this case, the contract is now extended to the 30th of November. And the principal agent or the architect, in most cases, will then agree on the extended date. In other words, he will award, in this case, an additional 10 days. You'll see right at the top, in this case, the contract is late. In other words, the extended date is the 30th of November, but the certificate is on the 12th. So the contractor is 12 days late. So therefore, we need to penalize the contractor, and we'll discuss that at the point. Right. So if we look at the escalation certificate, you'll see we've got two basically tables here, and you'll see the main one is for the main contractor. And then you'll have a separate calculation for the nominated subcontractors. In this case, only electrical installation. We could have air conditioning as a separate one. There could be ventilation, mechanical ventilation, which is also a separate one. So we're going to keep the main contractors' work separate from the nominated subcontractors. If you look at the layout, you'll see that we've got work groups. Now, work group 1, you'll see in the indices that we will refer to at the later stage. Work group 1 refers to earthworks. And then you'll see work group 190 is your preliminaries. Now, you'll see that in the indices, preliminaries is last, but in the bill of quantities, you'll find bill number 1, preliminaries first. So I don't mind if you start with work group 190, because that is preliminaries, bill number 1, and then obviously bill number 2 will be earthworks, work group 104. All right, so you've got your work group. So you're going to take all the value of the work that you've estimated on site, the work done, plus materials on site, and you're going to divide that up into work groups. Right, so let's look at earthworks. So you go on site and you value the work for earthworks, in this case 150,000 rand. So earthworks, which covers your excavate for trenches, carting away, backfilling, etc. The question here, is there materials on site for earthworks? I don't think so. Perhaps maybe sand filling imported for backfilling to sides of trenches and holes. That could be a specific item for materials on site. You will note at the top it stated work done, including materials on site. So this column to date is the value from day 1 up till to date. We always work with accumulative totals, and then we deduct what we've certified before. So for earthworks up till to date, in other words, up till the end of the 8th month, the value for earthworks was 150. Certificate 7 was the previous totals. And the value for certificate 7 for earthworks 104, we've got a figure here of 145,000. So that gives me then a total of 5,000 subject to escalation. Right, so we're going to apply now the formula based on this 5,000 Rand. We need to add on escalation on this 5,000 Rand. Now let's apply the indices. Obviously, I'm not going to give you the actual indices. We'll discuss that at a later stage. So you go and look up in the tables. You've identified IO, which is now the base month. That is the tender date, 20th of January. So January 2020 is your base month. You look up in the indices for work group 104, January 20, and that you'll find the IO indices 111.8. You'll do the same for the IE, which is the date of certificate, the 12th of December 2020. So therefore, 104 December 2020, the indice for earthworks is 117.1. Make sure that you understand the difference. Don't mix the two. IO is the base month. IE is the actual date of certificate. And then in the last column, you apply the formula, the 0.85 times V. Now V is the 5,000. 0.85 is your constant, times it by V, and then the IE divided by IO less 1 gives you 201 Rand and 48 cents. So you'll apply the formula for all the trades. In this case, there was only 4. You'll find that in a larger project, you'll end up with a large amount of work groups. Then you'll also note here that we've got non-adjustables, in this case 7,000, which is now the profit and attendance. Because we've got electrical, there is profit and attendance on electrical, but the profit and attendance on the electrical work belongs to the main contractor. Less the previous, and that will give you a difference there of 1,100. And note, on the non-adjustables, there's no indices, so we don't apply any indices. There's no escalation attached to non-adjustable. All right, no escalation, so therefore we don't apply any, you won't find indices for non-adjustable items. If we add up the amount for escalation, that gives me a figure for this month, month 8, of 544, plus then the previous escalation, that is now from certificate 1 to 7, the accumulative total was 45. So up to and including certificate number 8, we've got a total escalation figure of 45,544 Rand. That's for the main contractor. You'll do the same for the electrical, and note the electrical is work group 160, total to date, and this figure 145 rather, will be supplied by the electrical engineer. You will phone the electrical engineer and say, Mr. Engineer, I'm preparing certificate number 8. What is the value of the work done for electrical? In other words, work done plus the materials on site, and that figure of 145,000 will be supplied by the electrical engineer. Less the previous month, so we've got 10,000 Rand to pay the electrical contractor this month. And then we apply the indices, and note in this case, both the tender figure or the tender month, the IO, for both the electrical and the main contractor is the same. It can change depending on the actual tender date. So in this case, the tender date for both the main contractor and the electrical contractor is January 2020. The the IE will always be the same for the main contractor, because we're doing the escalation for this specific month, this December, the 12th of December. Right, do the calculation, 0.85 times V, IE divided by IO less 1, that will give you 1,332 Rand, plus the previous total, accumulative total for certificate 1 to 7, gives you 2,500. A total for up to and including certificate 8 of 3,832 Rand and 60 cents. So you'll do this up till practical completion, and you can make a note in this case, for this example, it is a practical completion certificate number 8. We will do number 9 in a few moments. When we look at final escalation, And that is based on the final account values. In other words, the contractor has now completed the job. At practical completion, he moves off site, and then the quantity surveyor has got 90 days to complete the final account. And I can guarantee you there will always be an amount due to the contractor, which is now, in this case, subject to escalation. For the final escalation, we've got another formula. And the formula that we're going to apply is AF divided by VF times V. Now, let's just explain the formula. AF is the theoretical amount, and that is the amount based on the values at practical completion. It's a theoretical amount. It is not escalation. And I'll explain that in the example. VF is the amount subject to escalation at practical completion. So you'll note that the AF and the VF values relates to practical completion. The V amount is the amount that is due to the contractor or outstanding subject to escalation based on the final account. All right, so AF divided by VF times V, we will then determine the escalation based on the final account, the outstanding amount. If the contractor is late, we will apply the formula AF divided by VF times V, and then we'll use the factor of 0.55. It's almost like a penalty, and we're not going to give the contractor full escalation. We'll only give him, let's say, 0.55. Now that's 55% of the total escalation based on the outstanding amount of V. Right, so we will come back to the calculations. I will just give you a quick rundown on final escalation. And remember now, the final escalation we will do only when we get to the final account, our very last exercise, which is the closeout of the project, compiling the final account. A typical example here, the AF value. Now, as we've said, the AF value is a theoretical amount based on the practical completion values. Now, if you look at this certificate, it's a replica of the certificate number 8 at practical completion. Now, let's just go and see the difference here. The only difference is that the previous totals is 0. Just look at the totals and the indices, exactly the same as the practical completion certificate. Now, let's just go back to certificate number 8, which was the certificate at practical completion. Now, certificate 8, as I said, is at practical completion. There you'll see the figures exactly the same, and in the indices, everything the same. You're going to repeat the practical completion escalation certificate. The only difference is that the previous totals is 0. And look at the amount here. It's an enormous amount, and that is not escalation. It's a theoretical amount. And what is meant by theoretical amount? If we take the 150,000 Rand for, let's say, earthworks, we all know that earthworks is done in the beginning of the project. Now, with the theoretical amount, the AF, we'll take the 150 and we spread the 150 from day 1 right up till the end. If it's a 12-month contract, you'll take the 150,000 and you spread it over 12 months. The same for, let's say, preliminaries and general or P's and G's, you'll take the 120,000 and you spread it over 12 months. In other words, we all know, for instance, let's say 116, which is masonry, or masonry is complete, let's say halfway through the contract, and then obviously there's no more escalation on masonry. But here we'll take the 130,000 for masonry and we spread it. So all the work groups are spread over the entire contract period, for instance. So therefore, this is a theoretical amount. It is not escalation. The same for the electrical installation. You'll spread the 145 at practical completion over the contract period. Good. So that's the AF value. And remember now, we are busy with final escalation. In other words, the contractor is now already off-site. Now you prepare your final account, 90 days to complete that. So therefore, you've got your draft final account, and based on that values, you're going to determine the final escalation. So to get to the final escalation, I need to determine that AF value, right? So the AF value is the amount, is the values at practical completion, and the only difference is that the previous totals is a 0. We don't have to calculate VF. Look at the definition for VF. It's the amount subject to escalation at practical completion. The amount subject to escalation at practical completion. So if we look at the practical completion certificate values, the amount that was subject to escalation is your 575, because we applied the indices only on that amount, not on the non-adjustables. So the VF is the value of 575,000 Rand. So I've got the AF divided by VF. Now to times it by the V, the outstanding amount, you need to then do your final account, and that is a process. And then you've done your final account, and then there's now the certificate number 9 based on the final account, and there's your final account values. You've paid certificate 8, so there's the amount outstanding. So the V amount, which is now subject to escalation, is the 9,000 Rand. So AF divided by VF times it by V, we still have to pay the contractor 9,000 subject to escalation. We'll pay him the 1,000, so he'll receive the 10,000, but we're only giving escalation on the 9,000 Rand only. So the AF was calculated, VF was the amount subject to escalation at practical completion. We've got still 9,000 Rand to pay the contractor, but this contractor is late, so we'll penalize him with the 0.55. So therefore, on this 9,000 Rand, which is still due to the contractor, he will only receive 208 Rand and 5 cents. Plus then the escalation accumulated from certificate 1 to 8. And then the total for the specific project for the certificate 1 to 9 is 45,752 Rand. The same for your electrical installation. The AF divided by VF times it by the 10,000 Rand. In this case, will give you 732 Rand and 93 cents plus the previous accumulative totals for certificate 1 to 8. So the total escalation for up till and including certificate 9, the final, is 45,065 Rand. Right. People, we will come back to the final escalation. I've just indicated to you that there is the 2 formulas applicable, and we will then look at the Hylett formula in our next lecture. So we will use the Hylett formula throughout up to practical completion for all payment certificates. And then when we get to the final account, we will use the formula AF divided by VF times V. And if the contractor is late, we will penalize the contractor. Good. This was just an introduction to escalation. We will continue with the exercises in our next lecture. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me and I will revert back to you. Good. Until next time, keep safe.